Hey everybody, TacticAngel back on the PlayStation 5 to take a look at another premium ship in World of Warships Legends. This time we'll be taking a look at the Zeven Provincien, a Tier 7 premium Dutch cruiser. For this review, I'll start with some history, talk about the ship and her stats, and then we'll finish off with some gameplay. If you do want to skip around though, you should see some time codes in the description. The Netherlands weathered World War I pretty well, being basically a country that threw its hands up quickly and said they wanted nothing to do with this particular fight. Was it the right thing to do? I don't know. Ask Belgium, which ceased to be a country there for a few years. By comparison, the Netherlands had its neutrality mostly respected, though the Allies, and by that I mean mostly Britain, blockaded the Netherlands for reasons slightly beyond a concern that the trading of flowers and bicycles might turn the tide for Germany. In fact, the Dutch had, and to some degree still have, a large coal and agricultural sector. And the Netherlands was able to pull off this mostly neutral status during the war because of some well-positioned political allies in Germany. Between wars, those officials happened to expire, and to put it lightly, there were some changes to the political situation in Germany. Reacting to this, the Netherlands started to realize that maybe the war to end all wars wasn't gonna quite end all of the wars, and there were at least two problems on the horizon. France and Germany seemed to be angling for a grudge match, and Japan didn't appear to have ever gotten the memo about the everlasting peace that was scheduled to follow. That put the Netherlands uncomfortably close to two potential rivals, and its Pacific holdings at risk too, since at this point, the modern-day country of Indonesia was known as the Dutch East Indies. Design work started in 1936 to create a new class of cruiser, and by 1937, the Dutch Navy had drawn up an incremental improvement over the earlier De Ruyter light cruiser that was laid down in 1933. That had been a somewhat scaled-back design due to political sentiments in the Netherlands at the time, and also financial constraints imposed by the Great Depression. The ship that would become known as de Zeven Provincien was laid down in May 1939. And as cruisers go, it takes a bit of time to finish them. So when the Germans decided that the Netherlands was now also Germany in 1940, she had yet to be completed. Originally intended to be armed with 10 15-centimeter main battery, produced by the Swedish Bofors company, the Swedes would hold on to the main battery, and instead the Germans would figure maybe they could fit the same 15-centimeter main battery that had been intended for the M-class cruisers to the ship, and you would recognize the M-class cruiser in-game as München. The Germans had started to build the M-class, but realized that they were going to be pretty terrible ships, and decided that maybe they'd complete Zeven Provincien instead with those 15-centimeter 52 caliber quick-firing turrets that were intended as the main battery for those cruisers and the secondary battery for several classes of German battleships, including some canceled projects. The torpedoes and AA guns would similarly be swapped out for German weapons then in service. Due to material shortages though, the waning interest in a German surface fleet, and one might say some disagreement on the part of the locals about whether the Netherlands was in fact Western Deutschland, very little actual progress on the ship was made. When the Netherlands was liberated in 1945, the ship was still far from complete. Her hull was undamaged though, and her machinery was in good order. But if the designs we've already seen on screen seem a bit dated for a post-war cruiser, you would be right. So a series of redesigns were laid out, proposing everything from an AA cruiser with 10 quick-firing 5.25-inch guns, similar to the Dido class of the Royal Navy and Friends, to ships with 6 or 8 6-inch guns instead. Ultimately, they settled on the design that you see in-game, which was one of the heavier designs by main battery, consisting of 8 15-centimeter 53 caliber Bofors guns, which was basically an updated version of the 10 guns that were originally planned for this ship. Work commenced again on the new design in 1947. She would launch in August 1950 and commission into service in November of 1953. Now, at the beginning of this, I said the ship that would be known as de Zeven Provincien was laid down in 1939. That might have been a bit of a linguistic sleight of hand, but de Zeven Provincien was renamed several times during this process. she was laid down as the Kiekwin, and shortly after construction, her name was changed in 1940 to Eendracht. When the Germans took control of the shipyard building it, she would be renamed KH-2, which is creatively Cruiser Holland 2, and likely would have been renamed something else had she actually been completed. Following the liberation of the Netherlands, the ship was renamed to De Ruyter, since the De Ruyter we talked about earlier was sunk during the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, and it may as well be a law in the Netherlands that there always has to be a ship in the Dutch Navy carrying the name of Admiral De Ruyter, including a frigate to this very day. But finally, De Ruyter would swap names with her sister ship to finally become de Zeven Provincien. Her sister, which would serve as the new De Ruyter once completed, had slightly fewer name changes, starting as de Zeven Provincien, becoming KH-1 under the Germans, you can guess what that means, and reassuming her original name after the war, then finally swapping her name with de Zeven Provincien. This is likely because the Dutch wanted the class to be called de Zeven Provincien, which unsurprisingly means the Seven Provinces, which is a reference to the Netherlands itself, which is officially the Republiek de Zeven Verenigde Nederlanden, or thereabouts anyway. It is a name with some importance to the Dutch, and this cruiser is the 7th ship so named following the unification of Utrecht in 1579, with the 8th ship still being in service today. That means it narrowly loses out to De Ruyter's 10 ships. Both cruisers would serve the Royal Dutch Navy for decades into the Cold War, and during that time de Zeven Provincien had a few major modernizations. The most visually striking was in 1962, when her rear turrets were removed to make way for a RIM-2 Terrier surface-to-air missile system. That said, the two would serve the Netherlands until the 70s without conflict. In 1976, de Zeven Provincien served her last day for the Royal Dutch Navy and saw another major refit, where the Terrier missile system was removed in favor of helicopter aviation facilities, as well as other modifications. And then she was transferred to the Peruvian Navy, where she would become the Buque Armada Peruana, or Peruvian Navy ship, Aguirre, and serve until 1999, before being sold for scrap in 2000. De Ruyter followed a similar path into the Peruvian Navy just a few years earlier in 1973, where she would be known as Admirante Grau until 2017. There were plans to preserve her as a museum ship, but unfortunately De Ruyter was sold for scrap just a few years ago in 2022. So that kinda ends the history of de Zeven Provincien, and in a way also De Ruyter. As for de Zeven Provincien in game, it's truly a horse of a different color, entering the game as the first Dutch cruiser, and the only ship currently to be in the Dutch Navy, so to speak. In some ways, its tricks are going to be pretty familiar though. It's just damage over time after all, but in this case, it's served up just a bit differently. As for the strengths of the cruiser, I guess we can just talk about the elephant in the room up front. De Zeven Provincien has 6-inch guns that can pretty reasonably lob islands and are decent in terms of fire starting potential. You also get an airstrike weapon where you direct planes to attack other ships at close to medium range. Those planes are pretty excellent sources of fires and can occasionally do some pretty impressive damage too. It might not be as much as hitting someone with a couple of torpedoes, but you can sit directly behind the tallest mountain in the game and fire those airstrikes without any problem from behind that friendly island. In fact, it's almost better to have tall islands in between you because it gives you perfect cover from returning shots and will limit the losses of your aircraft before they drop. It also is pretty strong at defending itself from the same kind of targeting, boasting long range and very high damaging AA. And increasing your AA equipment and skills can go a long way towards providing your team with at least a little bit of cover from carriers and other Dutch cruisers. And that's at least possible to do without even being spotted, because de Zeven Provincien is extremely well hidden by sea, from air, and even while firing in smoke. And she is so well hidden that she can even easily project her AA beyond her detectability range from air. And that is probably a good thing, because being seen in the open, taking shots in DZP, is not going to go that well. It's definitely in the delicate flower camp of ships, having both low hit points and very little armor. There are also very few ships that you can take in a fair fight. DPM on DZP is not that high, nor is the pen, and the performance of the AP is so poor that the chances that you do a lot of spike damage with your main battery is vanishingly small. And some folks are going to find the lack of both sonar and radar to be a bit disappointing. It makes running down smoke screens exceedingly dangerous, and it turns a slot on your team that usually goes to some sort of utility player into just another attritional damage cruiser. And the argument that there are better ships out there for that kind of task is pretty strong. Those vulnerabilities are probably going to force Zeven Provincien to be an island camper, use mostly exclusively HE shells, and supplement the fires started with your main battery with airstrikes. Though there's no ship in the game to compare this to in that sense, folks who find normal sorts of hide and shoot and other HE spammers, and also don't mind squishy cruisers that lack good utility consumables, may still find this ship to be quite fun. It's also not impossible that this ship could coax CV players into playing a halfway proper surface ship, but I can't be sure about that. Now don't get me wrong, it's probably nice if the first premium related to any line has a gimmick related to the tech tree ship, rather than a ship like Aigle, which shows up on PC with smoke, only for that to turn out to be an oddity by the time the line comes out. But it also bakes the fear of missing out into this campaign in a way that even something like exhaust smoke doesn't. And when you watch this video, you should be aware of that FOMO, so I'm going to say all of that up here before we start talking about the stats. So with 33,800 hit points, Zeven Provincien doesn't start out strong in survivability. Your armor isn't going to improve that much either. Actually, it probably is going to make it worse, since 13 to 100 millimeters doesn't tell you that much, other than there's no part of this ship that is particularly well protected. Yeah, you can bounce things off of your belt, but everything that isn't orange is penetrated by 15-inch guns. You can do the math on how many battleships won't totally wreck this. The best and only thing that is going to protect your citadel is that it's actually slightly below the waterline. Well, that, RNG, and player error. So you don't have a lot of hit points, you don't repel a lot of damage, and in fairness, this 19% torpedo reduction is good for a cruiser, but with D tier HP, you might not notice how much that's helping you when you get hit by a torpedo. Your main battery consists of 4 turrets, each with 2 152mm guns. The nicest thing about them is that all of them rotate 360 degrees. Their range is a totally average 15.6 kilometers, and though the 22.5 second turret rotation feels bad at times, it's only really slow for a light cruiser. Your 11% fire chance, 2150 HE damage, and 6.5 second reload is going to give you a slightly better than average fire starting chance and a slightly below average HE DPM. It's still maybe the more advantageous shell to fire in almost all circumstances because the 3000 AP damage is pretty terrible. It doesn't have great penetration, and it puts Zeven Provincien about 20% below average there. You don't have a secondary battery, which actually probably doesn't matter because there are very few occasions where you want to be that close to any ship. Also, you might want to fire exclusively HE because of that Dutch gimmick, which again are the airstrikes. It's hard to say how to really talk about this screen because it doesn't have some information that you probably need. It does have some mildly misleading information, I think, and the stats here really have very little to do with how you interact with your aircraft in the game. If you take anything away from this that is true, if you hit with an airstrike, there is a good chance that you are going to start some fires. This screen probably should tell you that you can have 3 airstrikes maximum at any given time, and they recharge one at a time, so not like multiple sets of torpedo tubes over the course of 65 seconds. They can be dropped within a certain range of your ship, which isn't listed here again, but is actually 12 kilometers. So the way this works is you're going to create a very small box of sorrow that will take about 14 seconds to fill. Your enemy is going to want to not be in that box of sorrow because these bombs can do a lot of damage, probably not the 6,000 listed here for several reasons, but one of them is that you're simply not going to hit a ship's citadel. I think it actually might be technically possible on 1 or 2 ships, but it's just not going to happen, okay? Even so, taking quarter pens with several bombs hurts, sometimes quite a bit. Bad news for you is almost any maneuvering that your enemy does, whether that's turning, accelerating, or braking, will likely cause you to miss a good portion, if not all of these bombs. This doesn't really tell you that each bomber drops several bombs, and I'm fairly certain each bomb doesn't have a 33% chance to start a fire, or else I have proof to a near mathematical certainty that the universe is secretly sentient and in fact hates me. But the important things are potentially very damaging, definitely a great fire starter. Permafires are a good reason to also shoot HE, but you're going to find this sort of hard to aim, and your success with these planes and interest in them is pretty much the major selling point of this ship. Moving from aircraft to AA, starting with a 90 rating, Zeven Provincien gets the game's nod as best Tier 7 AA cruiser, tied with Shimanto, but with an impressive 6-kilometer long range and a total of 486 damage per second. The Dutch cruiser edges out the Japanese light cruiser for damage per second there. It's hard to really figure what that means ultimately, but an AA build for Provincia is one of the few cruisers that can shoot down aircraft faster than the current floating airplane factories in-game can make them. And it is certainly at least safe to say that carriers with any concern about giving away clear sky medals will do well to avoid this cruiser during normal conditions. And that she's guaranteed to have defensive fire AA is going to make attacking DZP that much more costly. For maneuverability, I could sum this up by saying this ship feels almost identical to driving a Hyper-class cruiser. And that's due to the unimpressive 32 knot speed, the fairly normal 730 meter turning circle, and the completely average 9.1 second rudder. Perhaps as a result of being about a mile tall, your camera is set extra high on this ship, so it feels really slow moving around, but it's actually only about 1 knot below average for a cruiser, and maybe 1 knot faster than average, which is still not very fast, when using the engine boost. Moving into concealment though, Zeven Provincien has excellent concealment, which obviously throws a notion that the ship height has much to do with this value right out the window. But what I can tell you folks is it's a video game. And in this video game, Zeven Provincien has the second best concealment of any cruiser at Tier 7 right now. It's just 100 meters more visible by sea than Amalfi. And since hardly anyone is going to play that ship, there's a pretty real chance that you'll have the best concealment of anything that isn't a destroyer in the match. With 6.9 kilometer concealment by air, there's a very real possibility that you'll start shooting down planes before the carrier can even see you. And if you get the opportunity to fire in smoke, this 5.4 number is also second best at the tier, and hilariously even beats out ships like the Harbin that has smaller guns. Next, we're going to breeze through consumables, but since I've already talked about most of them, and they're all pretty standard stuff, this is going to be quick. You get a cruiser damage control party, totally normal. Then you have a standard 1/2 per second for 28-second heal. The only thing special about this is that you get 3 of them, just in case you don't get dev struck. You've also got DFAA, which we've already hit on, and it's nothing special, it's just a really good ship to have it on, and you don't get a choice, you're gonna get it. Then you have a consumable that you just assume replace with almost any other option, and that is your speed boost that will take you from a very slightly below average speed to a slightly above average speed for 2 minutes at a time. Wow. Now as we get into some gameplay, we're gonna be on Warrior's Path. I am of course going to be in Zeven Provincien. For those of you curious, you're going to get to hear a lot of Dutch here in a minute. I don't speak Dutch, I speak American and arguably something that resembles German. Dutch is very much in between those two languages, literally, geographically, plus it has some of its own oddities. One of them is that apparently the Dutch people don't pronounce N's on the end of words very often. So I've tried to preserve that in my pronunciation here. I am sorry if it has annoyed you, because it has surely annoyed me. In any case, I am going to go ahead and put my commander up on the screen. We have Karel Doorman, famous guy. Maybe we'll talk about him in the future. what we've got going on here is obviously a pretty conspicuous amount of paranoia. Given that this update is the CV update, I think you guys can understand why I might have built this like this. That said, it can also be pretty funny. It's very effective against CVs. And then, of course, I would suggest taking his unique legendary skill, because you're probably not going to need these extra consumables. And the ability to recharge some of these airstrikes quicker than normal is actually pretty useful. I would also use his unique 4th slot, which I will not try to pronounce, but it means follow me, I'm attacking. Probably in the opposite order, actually, which was kind of his famous last words. Or his last orders, anyway. In any case, we're rolling out to the west side of the map, and as we're doing that, we're putting shells out there on the destroyer that was spotted. I am looking over there with a cruiser coming up. You're thinking cruiser on cruiser. This feels like a fair fight. Realistically speaking, I don't want to have a fight even with a cruiser unless I have some reason that I think that I can like really tilt the scales in my favor. I'm going to put these shells out there in part because if I hit him a couple times, it will actually increase the amount of damage any of those bombs do. We only hit twice, so we don't get a lot out of it. He was probably turning just a little bit as he was backing up, and I either misread the map or, you know, that little bit of maneuvering gave him enough room to miss the little box of sorrow that you get to drop with these aircraft. So we're going to go ahead, jump into C. We don't really get there in time to get any points out of it, but we're going to start moving over towards the middle cap. There are a couple destroyers there. That's not great, because if it was only cruisers and battleships, obviously I would win out on the spotting. But I do want to help if I can with some of that damage against the little point scoring units. We'll try to throw some damage at the Lo Young. Carol Dorman's base trait is going to increase the damage just a little bit, which is nice from a DPM point of view. Also, landing hits, thanks to that I'm attacking skill, is going to incrementally tick up every subsequent hit that I get against each target. And it theoretically keeps track of all the targets. Near as I can tell, it actually does work. Which is a little shocking in its own right. That bonus builds up to 50%, so it actually could go a long way if anything survived for a long time and you did actually manage to do damage several dozen times. And you'll see me sizing up that Missouri several times here for some bombs. The shell hits actually count towards that, and then the bomb hits can do more damage. You could see, based on that island, we were trying to follow the Missouri around. He slowed down, but we still caught him just on the front of the bow. That starts a fire. And now we've got a second one on there. In case he's using baked potato, I'm going to go ahead and leave him. Just let him burn. And you can see with our excellent concealment, and even if 12 kilometers isn't a long way, we have some wiggle room to actually play with this against larger targets, which is nice. And we're going to turn in. We've got enough space that we can probably get behind that island that you see just to the right side of the screen. At that point, we'll be able to utilize the airstrikes while also maybe getting a couple of pot shots here and there on different ships. I don't feel super bad about doing a little bit of jousting with a cruiser. I just don't want to have to fight the whole thing on my own, particularly in a fair fight. And you can see, looks like we've spotted the Megami. If I can start getting shells on him, that means I can start getting extra damage on him. You'll notice a lot of times, particularly with this build, I am aiming high. And I am just trying to get damage. Because again, those later hits in the game are going to do just that little bit more. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but it adds up a little bit.
Torpedoes on backboard.
Now we get a good chance to see that quite a few of our airplanes were shot down there. And that's interesting because it kind of means that good AA functions a little bit like torpedo damage reduction, in the sense that only the planes that make it to the drop point will drop bombs. That makes sense. How many get away actually doesn't really matter. We'll go so far to say it doesn't change the recharge at all. But this is why I like to drop over tall islands. We're going to go ahead and take some pot shots at the carrier. It's useful to do at any point. I will say one of the most enjoyable aspects of playing Zeven Provincien is being able to airstrike aircraft carriers. We're a little too far away for that in this game, but oh my gosh, is it fun. Vengeance. I switch over to AP just in time for the Luoyang to back up into my field of view. Hilariously enough, I switch back over to HE, which I don't want for the cruiser because Luoyang just left. I have not had good luck doing AP damage at much other than this sort of range. More seriously, lightly armored targets at 6 kilometers or less, give or take. And then, of course, our squishy nature is exploited towards the end of the game. But this thing is just about to end anyway. And that means closing thoughts on Zeven Provincien. I mean, I like it, but it's really hard to say if you're gonna. It's also definitely in an update that benefits it a lot as a solid AA cruiser, and one that if you do play with another carrier on your team is only going to make the terrible things that a CV can currently do all that much more terrible. The only thing it can't do for you is spot. It's anyone's guess if the current implementation of the airstrike lasts in exactly the form that it's in right now. At least for now, it's unique. I rather imagine the uniqueness will probably last no more than a few updates, but it's all just a guessing game. And if this game has taught me one thing, it's that I'm much better at guessing what Dutch text says than making predictions about the future of the game. Zeven Provincien, there it is. Those are my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. And as always, I'll catch you on the next one.